Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Redlener. I am the president of the National EMS Quality Alliance. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I'm going to, I think we'll get started in just, it's 3:02. Let's get started, but I'm going to turn it over to Rick Murray, who's going to go through some of the housekeeping details for today. So that we can have an organized webinar and talk with you about the national quality measures. And we'll get started right now.
Thank you, Michael. Again, my name is Rick Murray. Thank you all for joining the first NEMSQA webinar. You should have the screen obviously up. So we'll use the chat function to submit questions and comments. If you'll look towards the bottom of your screen, there's a task bar that has several options. In the middle is the chat function. If you have a question or a comment, if you will type in your question, you have two options. You can send your question to the entire group, or you can send it to a person individually. I'd recommend if you would send it to the entire group. We'll pass it on to the presenter and they will answer it either if they can at the end of their presentation or at the end of the webinar. Also, at the very end of the webinar, there are some 3 exit questions that we ask you to answer for us. That will help us prepare for future webinars and give us some feedback of what was helpful and what you would like to see in the future. Let me check right quick and see if there's any comment. If you have any comments you want to ask before we start, feel free to do so. I see we've got some greetings going on, so I guess people know how to use the chat function. Without any other questions, Dr. Redlener, I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks so much, Rick. I'm very happy today to be presenting with my colleagues, Brooke Burton and Jeff Jarvis, 2 very well-known people in the field of EMS and really 2 great partners in developing and thinking about national quality measures. So today we're going to be talking about the National EMS Quality Alliance and really looking at improving patient outcomes through quality measures for EMS, and really thinking about how, now that they're out there, how you can use these national measures to improve the care that you provide in your service, in your area, in your city or region. So none of us have any financial conflicts to disclose. Again, as I've heard said before, we aspire to them, but not yet. Just one note before we start, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're all facing one of the biggest public health crisis that we've faced as a nation. You know, being in New York, this was something that the spring brought really a lot of challenges, but now we see such a widespread attention, widespread challenge with COVID-19 through all sectors of our healthcare. And EMS is at the forefront. So I'm thinking about all of you. I think we're all of us are dealing with a lot of similar challenges across the country. And you know, I think this discussion, you know, in the context of dealing with COVID-19, my feeling is that the more that we look at our measures, how we're doing through this pandemic. You know, even thinking about what we measure to capture the effect and the impact of the pandemic on our EMS care are all very important questions. I don't want to focus on it right now. It's not the topic of our attention, but it definitely colors and flavors everything that we think about in terms of building the medical aspects of EMS and what we do to measure how well we're taking care of patients. So this is in the back and probably in the front of everybody's mind. I'd like to start just a little bit about talking about what a performance measure is. I know at NEMSQA, we think a lot about the types of measures, how you create a measure, and how that you're trying to, in essence, capture the care that you provide in a meaningful way. Just from a basic structural point of view, a measure formula consists of a numerator and a denominator, and oftentimes you're looking at how you're performing on a specific type of case. But you have to think about what's captured within what you're trying to measure. I think that at the basic level, though, it's a formula that we're trying to create. And if you look at the types of measures, the families of measures, there are four different types, really. Structure, looking at kind of the structural context of a healthcare setting. Process, which most of what EMS does is, in terms of looking at patient care, is looking at processes. And we'll talk about evidence-based and that type of thing, which is important to kind of judge why we're measuring the things that we're measuring. Outcomes, of course, this is kind of the holy grail of what does what we do affect the outcomes for patients. And then we look at balancing measures. If we're doing this care, is there something else that's happening that is causing harm to the patient? And so these are the types of measures that are out there, and all of this kind of goes into the considerations of how NEMSQA does its work. Then if you expand a little bit further, right, we're looking at clinical areas or topics. In the case of EMS, there's a whole range of operational and clinical things that we should be thinking about. And this is kind of the broadest way that we're viewing these measures. And so when we think about what types of things we focused on, whether it's in EMS Compass, which I'll talk about in a minute, or whether it's related to the National EMS Quality Alliance, or whether it's something that you're developing or thinking about in your own system and or service. So, you have to think about the importance of a measure, what it's going to, and how you're going to report it. You want to think about feasibility. Is it something that you can measure? Is it something that you can actually do and accomplish? You're going to look at the scientific acceptability of the measure properties, which is, are these all valid? Are all the things that you're trying to measure valid? And then you're going to see if it's something that's usable and doable. When we're thinking about development of measures across our continuum of care, we have to look at, this from a development standpoint, really look at the measures that are out there and how to build measures that don't compete with something that already exists. And when we think about measure development at NEMSQA on a large scale, we, in some ways are fortunate because NEMSIS is a standardizing set of data, and it's useful to have NEMSIS as a way to kind of think about the data that we produce in our EMS care. And it kind of enables a common platform or operating framework in which to kind of build measures. There's bigger challenges in hospital data that don't collect things in a standard way. So there may be limitations to NEMSIS, of course, but it kind of colors our way that we think about what's in our scope. I often tell the story as an early medical director. I was thinking about really, how do I measure what kind of care is being provided by the paramedics and the EMTs who I work with every day? And if you search around, there's a lot of different ways or a lot of places to go to that have some element of EMS, and have been trialed in different ways. There's state-based measures. There's, critical care transport measures. There have been measures that have been developed by the EMS community. But then there are also things like CARES or Mission Lifeline that have elements of EMS, but are kind of focused on the larger system of care. And, it's been an interesting journey. And I think the one thing that brings us to where we are with NEMSQA is really this very focused view on EMS, and really standardizing the way we're thinking about measurement, and the way what we're thinking about, what we're considering measuring for EMS in terms of judging how we do as an industry and as individual agencies and care providers. So a little bit about the history of NEMSQA. As many people know, EMS Compass preceded the National EMS Quality Alliance. And there was a lot of work done at EMS Compass to do this work of establishing a national measure set for EMS. And that work was done, but it wasn't finalized. And in conjunction with the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NEMSQA and ASAP, NEMSQA was formed as a way to bring the EMS community together with some seed funding to really, again, work on this problem of creating measures for for EMS in general. So in 2017, the organization was formed. In 2018, our board of trustees was established, which I'll show you just the list of those founding agencies and organizations in just a minute. And over the course of 2018 and into 2019, we were tasked with taking the EMS Compass measure set and really creating a measure set that represented kind of a national picture, something that needed to be respecified and identified as measures that we could move forward with and could apply more generally for EMS to use across the country. And since 2019, obviously COVID has been a challenge for all of us, and many things paused. I think that whatever we were doing, everything paused sort of. So we've had some, challenges kind of getting back to the work that we were tasked to do. But I think that we're in a great place right now, which, today is really part of this, an opportunity to roll out these measures, to talk with people about how they might be used and implemented in systems. And then, the other thing that's happening at the National EMS Quality Alliance is that we're working with Florida as part of a HRSA grant to develop additional measures for rural EMS. Honestly, a lot of those measures apply for general EMS, but again, I think this process of working on kind of a unified way or a uniform way of looking at EMS measures is going to be very helpful for all of us. So this is the vision, right? This is the vision. Improving patient outcomes through the collaborative development of quality measures for EMS and health systems of care. And then our mission is developing and endorsing evidence-based quality measures for EMS and our healthcare partners that improve the experience and outcomes for patients and care providers. I think we have to talk about value. So what do we bring to the table related to this measure development, right? At the end of the day, we think this process helps our patients receive better care because we're focused on the things that matter. It helps our providers be safer and more resilient if we're measuring things that matter to the care of the safety and health of providers. And it provides essentially a standardized quality language for improvement, right? So, and that's part of what we're talking about today is really how does this standardized measure set that's evidence-based apply to the work that you are doing on an everyday basis. It enables benchmarking. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Jarvis at some point in this presentation so that he does a much better job and is probably a much higher IQ than all of us put together, but he can explain how benchmarking works and why it might be important as we move forward with measures and how they look and how they're used. And again, there's really an opportunity to talk about the creation of standards and standards across the country that matter for patients and patient outcomes. So just, one of the things I like to highlight in these settings is really the breadth of people who've been involved with the founding of this organization. There is a long list of agencies and organizations that have contributed to this development, and it's important just from the partnership aspect of having those folks involved and having them, all of us contribute to the development of measures for use in EMS, in the EMS context. This is a bit about our leadership structure. We have a NEMSQA membership that the Board of Trustees reports to, and the president who reports to the Board of Trustees, and we have an executive director and committee structure that all work together to build the measures. So, I think one of the most important things, there's a lot of boxes on this slide. I think it makes the point. I don't expect you to read the fine print here. This process, I believe, is available on the website in a little bit more detail. But this is really a thought out measure development process. It's very important for us that this is out in the open, that there's transparency about how this is done. And so there can be reproducibility and that there's trust in the viability of these measures. I think that, we strive to put this together so that it would be public facing and guide the work that we do. So, the main part, and I'll kind of simplify it, right? So this is kind of the English version of that, which is, you're looking at identification, prioritization of new measures, right? Things that are important to EMS and to the care of our patients. And if they exist, you go to the left, you adopt existing quality measures that are out there. And that's one thing. If you go down and you have to develop a new measure, there are three aspects of that measure development that need to happen. The research, right? Is this evidence-based? Specification. Can we get that data that we're interested in from the existing health records? And what do we need to find and pull out either from the NEMSIS fields or from some other data source so that we can capture what we want to capture? And then there's a testing and learning phase where we run through the process essentially of running these measures in data sets and see if they, again, meet certain standards around how they perform. Do they reflect what we want them to reflect? And so there's there's a breadth of things that need to happen and a depth of testing and learning in particular that go into each of these measures in the measure development. And then we have a structure for, again, board approval, continued measure deployment, QI, big data testing to confirm what we thought might be true, and then kind of endorsement of these measures by NEMSQA and by potentially other organizations. But I think the one thing that I'd like for you to take away is there's two pieces to this. One is that it's a rigorous process, and two is that it's not a static process. It's an iterative process. So these measures are developed, and then every year that we go back to them to make sure that they're performing well. And this is kind of where you all come in terms of giving us feedback about what's working and what's not working. If there's something that's not working and something needs to be respecified or rethought about, or there needs to be an extra data field added, these are all things that we will do as part of being the organization that's coming out as really the standard bearer for EMS quality measures. Right, and then what we did with the EMS Compass measures was fit the work that had been done, and it was a tremendous amount of work, that we took the 14 final measures from that EMS Compass project recommended, and we put them through this cycle. And we came out with our, these are the categories of the Compass measures. We put them through our cycle, and we came out with this set of 11 measures that has a breadth, it has a range of sophistication, and we strived to find measures that were easy to implement and that were meaningful in terms of the overall care that was provided. We'll go through some of the details in just a bit. I don't know if any of you have had the chance to explore the website a bit, but there's all sorts of resources that are available when you look at these measures. And the point is, and what we strived for was not only this high level look at it, but really the applicability to every EMS agency in the country. We want this to be easy to deploy. We want it to be useful for folks when they're looking at the care that they provide. And so I don't know if I feel like I'm talking straight. So if there's any questions or if there are any comments that come up that seem to be in line with the conversation, I'm happy to entertain as we go along. But these measures here, as you see that there's a hypoglycemia measure, although, this is kind of like a very basic idea. But there are some places in this country that don't treat seemingly aren't able to treat the hypoglycemia that they're measuring. And so there are certain measures that kind of guide systems to the ability to provide care for certain clinical situations. So that, there are some that are a bit more basic. It's kind of like, in my mind, the hypoglycemia measure is sort of like, do you jump out of an airplane without a parachute, right? You just can't, you got to do it, and there's not going to be any randomized control trials to check whether this is functional or not. But it's something that's basic, that at least the way we measure it, it seems like there's a wide variety of treatment of these patients. So I think that as you go down the list, there's a range of pediatric measures. Again, documenting weight is a very basic function of what we do. And so and one of the things that is the most important about treating kids is making sure that you have the correct weight so you can give the correct dose of a medication. So there are certain things that are built in to, that are basic, but it's not consistently done across the country. So some of these are just based on that. There's a couple, and we're going to talk about lights and sirens more, but there's a strong evidence base for using lights and sirens in only the most needed situations, because the incidence of accidents and injury to patients and to providers is very high, and the evidence for that is very strong. I won't preempt my colleagues in this, but and then there's actually one outcome measure, which is effective pain management, and that's something that we can see as it's an outcome of, it's an indicator of satisfaction and of treatment for patients that we can see in front of our eyes. So this is the one outcome measure out of these 11, and many of them are process measures that have some basis in evidence. So there's a broad range, and there's opportunities for you to use many of these measures in your system. So we took, there's 14 in EMS Compass, and we arrived with 11. And some of that has to do with redundancy. Some of that had to do with being able to measure one of them you had to use hospital data, which we know is very difficult for many services across the country. There was some lack of evidence for other measures that we didn't feel comfortable putting out as part of our first measure set. So there was some discretion we used if the process showed us that it wasn't the right thing to do. And so if you go, I don't know how many of you have been to the website, but there's a lot of resources. If you are looking to deploy, there's technical resources. There are justifications for the use of these measures, and it's really there is a great deal of well thought out material there that is available to you for you to use. I have to give a lot of credit to Kelly Burleson, who is our measure development specialist, who's been really helping to guide and shape this this process at this organization since we began. So she's not on the call today, but has had a big hand in helping us think through how to present this material in a way that makes sense for all of us. You know, again, there's the specific. This is stroke 01. It's just to demonstrate that not only on the left-hand side you have the very detailed specifications and the inclusion criteria, where you're getting the NEMSIS fields that are associated with it. There's even more detailed set of information around this. And then I don't know, I put the storybook on the right, but there's a whole section about why we, again, the story of the measure, why we chose it, why we selected what we did. For those of you who are aware, there's an organization that looks at evidence-based guidelines. And this is something that, they've been thinking about measures as part of their projects. And so the Evidence-Based Guideline Consortium has been building evidence for areas of EMS for a long time. And there's some ongoing coordination with that group so that we're not duplicating one another's efforts. We are coordinating when it seems feasible. We're a lot allying on specific projects. So this is, again, we're not here to reproduce what other folks are doing, but really to think about how measures are built and support the clinical evidence. One of the things that's important, and you're going to hear from both Brooke Burton and from Jeff Jarvis about their experiences in dealing with data, but we know that the data isn't perfect. Anybody who's ever dealt with any data in EMS knows that it's not perfect. So we understand that there are limitations around what we capture, how we capture it, and we know that it's not perfect. But at the same time, we have a duty to really start thinking about what our care looks like, and we need to kind of adjust to the realities that you're never going to have perfect data, but we're going to look to optimize our approach to how we view data. We'll talk a little bit about how we approach this and about how we think about perfecting it, and how we integrate that process in the respecification of measures as we go. There's a diversity of EMS. I don't have to tell the folks on this call that there's a diversity of EMS within states, probably within cities. There's a diversity of EMS, whether it's volunteer versus paid, whether it's call volume, whether they're the protocols are made at the state or at the local level, whether there's BLS versus ALS. Every locality has its own iteration of what EMS looks like. And so, I think that when we think about these measures and how they're built, we have to think about where they'll be applied. And so there's been some thought, and I always welcome folks to give more feedback about how this works and how this looks. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this might apply to different folks. So, whether it's New York City, whether it's the largest EMS system in the world, or whether it's a small town volunteer service, we think that that these measures are useful for the to improve the care of patients. So I think I'll start the conversation, but I'm really going to turn it over to Dr. Jarvis and to Brooke Burton about these kind of next steps of the conversation. I'm happy to kind of give the broad view of it, but they'll get kind of talk a little bit more in the weeds about how this works and what this looks like. But the last thing I'll say is really that these national EMS quality measures can really be a useful source of kind of a validated, vetted, evidence-based measure with a variety of areas to consider that work that works with NEMSIS and what you already have to do, most likely related to documentation and adherence to NEMSIS and that type of thing. So they're designed to be used. And so part of the goal of this talk today is really to talk about, let's talk about how they can be used and what it looks like on an agency level or in a regional way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, and Jeff can guide me in my when I advance the slides and do the basic housekeeping here.
Perfect. Michael, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So what I'd like to do is focus on sort of a practical matter, and then I'm going to come back in a little bit and expand on this practical matter. So if you look, let's say you are an agency and you're looking to start measurement to improve your quality, and you're not really sure where to start. NEMSQA is an outstanding place to start for all of the reasons Michael just talked about. We have these validated measures that are evidence-based, and they are really good places to start. So as he just went through, we have 11 of them. How do you pick a measure? How do you pick a place to start? And I would very much recommend, if you are new to improvement, that you don't pick all 11, because, and I can promise you this, I learned this the hard way, if you just start measuring everything, you're really measuring nothing, and you're certainly improving nothing. Much as I learned from some cartoon shows, if everybody is super, then nobody is super. And the problem that you come in with is you just get overwhelmed by measurement, and you end up measuring for the sake of measurement. Now, I'm a huge nerd, and I like measuring just because it's kind of cool, but that doesn't benefit our patients. So the first thing that we need to do is really focus on something that matters to our organization and our patients. So what matters? If you look at all 11 of those, you could easily say, well, they all matter. But the idea here is to pick one thing and start with it. So find something that matters most to your organization. Let's say, like one of my agencies, Marble Falls Area EMS, let's say that you have experience with a EMS collision where one of your medics died. That's a horrible situation, but when that happens, it really focuses your attention on how to make sure that never, ever, ever happens again. And one of the things that you will learn as you dig into the literature is red lights and sirens is how EMTs and paramedics die. So you look down at our safety measures, and there is one right there, Safety 01. It is the proportion of 911 responses that respond without red lights and sirens. That is something that you can make a clear case matters to your organization. Next, if you want to move from measurement to improvement, you really need to find something that you are incredibly passionate about. If you're not incredibly passionate about it, you're going to lose interest in it and move on to the next bright, shiny thing. And I'm not saying that as an attack against you. I really like my bright, shiny things. So we have to do something to stay focused, and picking something that we're passionate about helps us do that. Now, if you want, one thing I would love to do is say we are really going to focus in on the care we provide to our patients in diabetic ketoacidosis as measured by the length of ICU stay. That's important, but the challenge is we're not very good at identifying who has diabetic ketoacidosis and who doesn't. And the reason we're not is it turns out you need to measure an anion gap to do that. And we don't have the ability to do that in the field. If you were going to do that and you wanted to look at how accurate you were, you would need access to hospital data. Most of us don't have that on a routine, regular basis. So the ability to call somebody up at a hospital and get follow-up on an individual patient is great and is highly useful. And I'm really thankful that there are hospitals who are willing to provide that information. but that is not, it's not a realistic way of obtaining data to use for a process measure. Doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying, but it just means that's not what you should pick for your measure. So look at something that you have the ability to measure. Next up, you have to pick a measure where there is buy-in in your organization. So I can tell you this again with personal experience. If you pick as a measure, you want to improve the proportion of patients or proportion of 911 responses where you don't use red lights and sirens, it is possible that there are parts of your organization that fundamentally do not agree with the core concept, which is that red lights and sirens are not necessarily a good thing. So if half of your organization thinks that you are absolutely smoking crack and you're full of it, we need to go to lights and sirens to everything because people are going to die if we don't. You can measure all you want, but you're not going to get much traction because you don't have buy-in to it. So you need to work on the buy-in first. And then my advice to you when you're beginning this improvement process is find something that is achievable. You want an early win so that you can have success behind you as you go on to improve your efforts. So those are my top 5 things to look for when picking a NEMSQA measure. Michael?
Jeff, yeah, no, and I would reiterate something that you said, which is the buy-in piece of this. And sometimes we know it's important, but other people aren't convinced. I think that there are a lot of ways to approach that, not just give it up, but to kind of there are tactics and ways to approach folks with data, with demonstrating the science behind it. I think that there's a lot of work that can be done to bring a group along to see, you know, why it's important that we are attending to these things. And so, yeah.
Sorry, Mike. I would add too that we bring everybody in early in the process as well. So, you know, those people that we have to convince, bring them in early in the process and give them a seat at the table in making those recommendations and choices and decisions.
One of the things I like to do with any improvement effort, any change at all, is find the leaders in our organization. And by leaders here, I don't mean the people with titles. I mean the people who actually lead our organization, and find the ones that are going to be most likely to get thoroughly pissed off about what I'm doing. And I work with them on an individual basis, and I get them to become an advocate for the position I want to improve on. And it turns out it is so much easier when you're not the only one pushing something. Yeah, great point, Brooke. And I think you're up next.
So yeah, so it's a great segue, I think. And so I'll turn it over to you a little bit about, I'll turn it over to you fully, actually, to talk about what do you do? How do you start?
Sure. So you found something important, you've selected a measure. The first thing that you need to do is figure out where you're going to get your data from. So what data source is that coming from? Is it coming from CAD data? Is it going to be a poll that you ask your providers? Is it going to be through your PCR data? And then you're going to get a baseline. You're just going to see where are we at right now, so that you know where you might want to go. So first things, get a baseline and start tracking that data. You want to look at it over time. If you can get previous historical data, that's great. That gives you a head start. Or if you're starting, from the beginning, you want to just start looking at where am I at, tracking that data. The next thing you're going to do is when you see where your data is. So in this example, we're looking at was a stroke exam performed. And this chart is looking at the percentage of time that a stroke exam was performed for patients in the system. So when they started tracking that data, the system was at, a little bit below 40% on average. And we know that we want to get that up. And so as they're tracking that over time, they start trying different change methods. They make ideas for how they can do that improvement, and they're tracking those through the chart. So you can see there's a memo here, there's some training here that they did, and they're marking when those things happened and how those affected the system. So one of the improvement ideas they had after those initial ideas didn't work was that they would change the validation program in the PCR software so that crews were required with any stroke impression to do that exam and document that. And so you can see that that made a big difference, a jump, when they put in that validation that allowed them to continue on and be more successful in getting this measure completed. And you still have to watch this data even after you have those improvements, because you can have dips back down where you may have to do new change ideas as well. So that's kind of just a little brief overview of one project that a system that you can do. But start with a baseline, look at it over time, get your team together, make a change idea, put it in place, and work on improvement from there. So I'll just show you a little bit about a project that I've been working on in my system that I've started. This red lights and sirens is a hot topic. And I know I saw that Matt Zabatsky's on this call, and he's been really pushing that too from the, from his association angles. And it is really a big thing. So I thought I'm going to look at this, and I was lucky in that these measures, the NEMSQA measures, are built into my PCR system. So it's pretty easy for me to gather data through that PCR system. But you might not have that built into your system from your PCR vendor, or you may even still be doing, paper charts. So just make sure that you're able to collect the data, that you know where to get it and where to look for it, and you can put it together. When I pulled up my Safety 01, the use of lights and sirens during response in my PCR system, I got a really interesting result. So in that data, it was showing me that 97% of our calls were being responded to red lights and sirens. And I knew that was not right. So here's where we talk a little bit more about that, that dirty data, because the way that every system documents is not always the same. And the way that each PCR vendor may be pulling that data and utilizing it to give you analytics back is also not always the same. NEMSQA was created to be kind of this national standard that got us all on the same page, but not everybody always uses those NEMSQA data fields in the same way as well. So that's where this was challenging. So I knew this data wasn't accurate, and I'd have to dig a little bit deeper. So I was able to pull CAD data from my system from dispatch. And if you go to the next slide, when I ran that data, I saw that really it was about 57, 58% of our calls that were responding lights and sirens too. So I just caution you to, if your data doesn't seem exactly right, do a little investigation, make sure that you're getting accurate data, that you're using it from a spot, where it's meant to come from. And if you see measures that aren't working, we actually have a comment section on our site, the NEMSQA website, that you can send us feedback so that we can help to either talk to PCR vendors or talk to NEMSQA or work together to, again, get us all on the same page for these measures so that they're easy to look at and the data is all coming from the right places. So just a little cautionary tale there of find out where you're looking for your data.
I would just add to that. I think that there's two components of like of quality data, and really it's the documentation and the care. And the closer we can get with the alignment of those that information, the better we're going to be able to make an impact on the care. I mean, but until we get to a point where we're looking at something that we feel at least relatively comfortable with, then it's going to be a challenge to make any changes and to see the impact of those changes.
Definitely. Great point. So go ahead and move forward. So at that point, when you get a good idea of what your data is and you see, what you can do with that data and where you should go from here, that's where you're going to work on your improvement plan. And personally, I really like the Institute for Healthcare Improvements performance improvement plan. They use PDSA cycles, the Plan, Do, Study, Act. So that's what I personally use in my system. Some people use Six Sigma, Lean. There's several out there. So I would say just get a system and use it. That NEMSP also does an excellent course on performance improvement as well each year, that you can learn more about how to do this performance improvement process. But the bare bones of it is just that you develop a plan. So what do you want to do to improve? In the lights and sirens, maybe your plan could be, We're going to look at all of our cases of response for lights and sirens. We're going to see how many of those we actually transport the patient to the hospital, red lights and sirens, and compare the two. Maybe we also look to see how many of those patients, had an ALS intervention en route to the hospital. So, did they really need that response? And that could be a way to start your plan and say, okay, this population doesn't really have ALS interventions. We don't transport the lights and sirens to the hospital. Maybe we take one crew or one shift on a certain day and we change how they're responding to this population and see how that goes with our system. See if there's any problems that come up with patient care after, see if it's safe to change the way that they're responding for just a small part of the population. Then that's your study part, your do and study. So you look at those, and then if you are getting great results after your do and study, then you're going to act on those and roll it out to larger areas in your system. So, now I'm going to roll it out to an entire shift. And if things still go well there, we're going to roll it out to everybody in the system eventually and scale up. So sometimes you have to revise your plan. Sometimes those plans don't work and we have to change them, or we have to abandon them completely. But that's kind of how you use that data, go through that cycle and make those changes in your system.
Great. Thank you so much, Brooke. Jeff, so this is always our cue for the part of the discussion. So I'll take you into it with benchmarking.
Perfect. So, Michael lives in New York City, and there are, you can say a lot of things about New York City, but they have clearly invested in parks and they like nice park benches. And I think that's the reason he's just so fond of those park benches. So I want to talk about basically the same metric and some of the same issues that Brooke brought up. So one of the things that I have done to help validate these measures is run them against the anonymous ESO research data set. And I updated that for based on the 2019 release. And this is what I'm looking at. And what you will find out is that Brooke's initial response is not that far off from what National is. So let me just explain the methodology for this very briefly and tell you what you're looking at. So if you look over on your left at the table, what you're looking at is I ran this measure, and the measure, again, the denominator is any 911 emergency response. So that's the denominator. The numerator, the number on top, is the number of those calls that responded to the scene without lights and sirens. So that's what we're measuring. And I wrote some code that looked at all 1,232 agencies in the system that had one of these responses and had data that was valid. Turns out that I'm pretty sure they did not run the call in 1901. So there's an example of some data that's not particularly good. So I excluded that. And I also excluded anything that was done in another EPCR system and then imported into ESO because the validation rules would be different. And I also only looked at NEMSQA version 3 compliant records. We ended up with 5.9 million individual responses. And the median, I calculated this for each agency and then looked at the median of those performances. So the median agency performed at 4.5%, meaning according to this, 96% of their responses are with lights and sirens. Now, when you're looking at a huge national data set, you can't do what Brooke just did. You can't dig into the data and try to identify what's going on. What I will tell you is that there are some very large agencies in the ESO data set, and they respond to a large portion, like approaching 100% of their responses with lights and sirens. And that will skew the overall data towards using lights and sirens. I measured a couple of breakpoints for median, and just remember median is the middle number. You can look at the 25th percentile, 10th percentile, 75th, 90th maximum, and then what the average is. So then for each agency, I wanted to get an idea of the variation in performance on this metric. So if you look at that plot, that is a line made up of a whole bunch of dots. Each dot represents one agency. And then there's a little line that runs through that dot. That line is the confidence interval, the 95% confidence interval. And the dashed line running across, horizontally across there is at 4.4%. So that's the overall median. So if your agency, your entire confidence interval was below that median, then you were considered an underperforming agency on this measure. Likewise, if your entire 95% confidence interval was above, you were considered a high-performing agency. And if you crossed that median, you were just hitting the standard performance. Now,
can I ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
So if I'm an agency that has 0%, that means that I respond to every call with lights and sirens.
That's correct.
Okay, and if I'm at 75% for this measure because it's not using lights and sirens, then 25% of the time I'm responding with lights and sirens.
That's correct. So one of the things that's a little counterintuitive is the way the measure is written. We actually, and I remember the meeting where we were discussing this, and I think this was your point. What we would normally say is, well, let's just look at the proportion of lights and sirens responses, and we want to decrease that. Well, we crafted all of the measures where a higher proportion, a higher number is better. It's just an easier thing to do. It's consistent. So in order to make a higher number better, we had to invert it. So I think what Michael is saying is a really important thing to remember about this. This graph is not lights and sirens response to the scene. It's non-lights and sirens response to the scene. And again, higher is better. So what's that?
It saves lives.
Yeah, clearly. Let's go ahead. It does. Non-lights and sirens response turns out to save probably more lives than lights and sirens response. Yeah, switch to the next slide, if you will. And what I'm going to do is show essentially the same slide Brooke had. This is for my agency. And what you will see is if you just glance at this, you'll see that something changed. There was a really low number over a period of time, something changed, and then that number got higher. What changed is we took our first pass at looking at how we dispatch calls and how we respond to calls, and we changed our criteria. Now, our initial estimate, very rule of thumb-ish, is we tried to determine which calls would benefit from lights and sirens responses. Our initial approach was to look at whether we went to the hospital with lights and sirens, realizing that's not perfect by any means, but it's a rough rule of thumb. And then we looked at the call natures that the determinant codes that ended up with lights and sirens responses to or transports, and we made those lights and sirens responses, whereas the ones that had a very low proportion of lights and sirens transport, we made non-lights and sirens. It's not perfect, but what you'll notice is that it increased our proportion of lights and sirens responses. Now, the next thing I'll say is I just want to echo what Brooke said. We are looking at this data also, and we also looked at our CAD data and showed about 40 to 50% lights and sirens response. Now, because I also respond in the field, I will tell you that that's not necessarily accurate either. So we have to, now what we have is a good old-fashioned data conundrum. So what that means is we need to set up a PDSA cycle and really dig into the data to figure out what is the disconnect between what is coming out of the CAD and what is happening and what is being documented in our EPCR. So some people might look at this and say, well, the data's dirty. What the hell's the point of measuring it all? I'll tell you what the point of measuring is. If we had not started measuring this, we never would have noticed this. And we would never do anything to improve the quality of the data, which will help improve the quality of our improvement efforts. The bottom line is we want to respond safer with fewer lights and sirens responses. And in order to do that, we need to get better and better data. And for anyone out there who is thinking, well, I'm just not going to start improving until I get perfect data, you're never going to start improving then. You will never get perfect data. I like to say that science is an asymptote to knowledge, meaning that you are gradually getting closer and closer and closer to true knowledge, but it's a continuing process. Quality improvement and measurement is an asymptote to accuracy and truth. You're never going to be there 100%. You just want to get closer and closer and closer. So it's a continual process, and you always have to keep at it.
Great. Great. All right. Well, listen, I think we're pretty close to the end. There's just some information about participating and joining NEMSQA that's here. I think we'll make these slides available for folks. I don't know if we've talked about that specifically. And, you know, we continue to do, we're very active in terms of the work that we're doing. And, you know, the idea is that we as an organization are doing something similar to what Jeff and Brooke described, which is really we're trying to get better all the time. And again, part of this is about feedback from you, the users, the frontline folks who are doing this work every day, so that we can improve the way that we measure and improve our ability to help patients around the country. This is the information. This is the feedback for any comments related to measures. And you know, I think we have a few questions, so I'll leave this screen up. But Rick, maybe you can tell us what the questions are.
Yes, we have one up now. I believe Dr. Jarvis must have answered the other one directly.
No, Rick, Dr. Jarvis is a moron and clicked the wrong damn button. So
okay.
I was just trying to unclick it and didn't do it.
Okay. So the first question is NEMSQA working with any EMR providers to improve or standardize bidirectional data exchange? Would be amazing if it was automatically connected with the NEMSIS data and enable more outcomes measures.
It's kind of a question and a statement at the same time. So I agree that it would be amazing if we could connect NEMSIS data and connect it to the hospital data and get all of our outcome data related to that. I think those types of projects are in the works. There are all these data exchanges and ideas. There are specific companies that work on that crossover between the in-hospital and the pre-hospital data. But the answer is yes. I mean, there's a lot of folks who are involved, who are, you know, big quality folks who also work as EMR in EMR development and in companies that are supporting NEMSQA. First Watch, for example, is one of our corporate partners. But the idea is that we are working and giving the information and the work that we've done, are sharing that freely with all of the vendors. And the idea is that they will adopt and incorporate. Some are further ahead than others. It's out there for them, and it's something that, you know, we are encouraging to the community and to the product side. And we have an increasingly good relationship with a lot of those vendors who, you know, I think will benefit their product and the service to EMS agencies and to patients by incorporating a lot of this. So we're definitely part of our efforts to standardize that.
The other question from Emory was in your data regarding the non-lights and siren response, does your data include only transport vehicle, or did you include non-transport first responders in that data?
You bet. So, and I really apologize for hitting the wrong button there. I included so there are two separate ones. Safety one is response to scene, and I included all agencies responding. So that includes non-transport agencies and transport agencies. Now, what I will tell you is the data set itself is heavily skewed toward transport agencies. So the vast majority, and I'm sorry, I don't have Rimley's codebook open in front of me, or I would tell you, but the vast majority of data in this data set is from transport agencies. But I did not exclude those. In the transport to the hospital, by definition, if you're transporting, you're a transport agency. So safety 2 is restricted just to transport agencies.
Thank you.
I'd just like to go back to Rob's question and say that we do have really good partnerships with NEMSIS. We have a NEMSIS representative that works with us, in this process that we're doing here with NEMSQA. And I sit on their internal review board as well. So there's a lot of, processes that go back and forth, and we are working on data exchange and some of those big questions and how to tackle those coming up.
Great. Well, listen, I think we're coming to the end of the hour, but I hope that you've had an opportunity to kind of hear from us, understand a little bit more. I hope that if there's any questions, you'll reach out to us. And we think that this is an important work and can benefit the patients that we take care of. So this is really, we're going to be working on how to do this more often. So to dive into some of these questions. This is really kind of a first glance, but I think that there's a lot to talk about. We could probably do a webinar on each measure and kind of talk through all the details. I don't know how big our audience would be, but it would be definitely a thing to do. But if there's any recommendations or thoughts or things that you'd like to hear, please fill out the surveys that you will get as you close the webinar. It's great to see you, and look forward to the next time we see you. And
thanks, y'all.
I want to say thank you to the NEMSQA staff, to Rick, to Deanna, to Cherie Murphy, and to the board, and especially to Jeff and to Brooke for being great co-presenters.
And to Dr. Redliner for being our fearless leader.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you all, and it's great to see you. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.